It was a dark and stormy night, and Sarah was driving home from her late shift at the diner. The rain was coming down in sheets, making it hard to see the road ahead. As she drove, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was following her. She tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, but the further she drove, the more certain she became that she was not alone on the road. She could see the headlights of a car in her rearview mirror getting closer and closer. Terrified, Sarah stepped on the gas, but the car behind her followed suit. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she realized that the car was not just following her, but was trying to run her off the road. Just as she thought she was about to lose control of her car, the headlights behind her suddenly disappeared. She breathed a sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. As she rounded a bend in the road, she saw the same car, now sitting idly on the side of the road with its headlights off. Sarah's first instinct was to keep driving, but something compelled her to stop. She pulled over and cautiously approached the car. As she got closer, she realized that the car was abandoned and there was no one in sight. But as she turned to walk back to her car, she saw a figure emerging from the shadows. It was a man dressed in black, with a hood covering his face. He was holding a knife, and he began to run towards her. Sarah screamed and ran back to her car, locking the doors just in time. She started the engine and floored it, not daring to look back until she was miles away. But even as she drove home, she couldn't shake the feeling that the hooded man was still following her, watching her every move. She couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched, and she was sure that the hooded figure was still out there, somewhere in the night. The next day, Sarah went to the police, but they were unable to find any evidence of the hooded figure or the abandoned car. They thought Sarah had just imagined the whole thing, but she knew what she had seen was real. From that night on, Sarah never went on a night drive alone again. She would always make sure someone was with her. But even then, she couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. The memory of that night would haunt her forever, and she could never truly feel safe again. Years passed, but the hooded figure was never found. But the legend of the night drive killer lived on, and many people reported seeing a hooded figure on the side of the road, holding a knife, and chasing after unsuspecting drivers. Some even claimed to have seen the abandoned car, still sitting on the side of the road with its headlights off. No one knew who the hooded figure was or why he was doing this, but one thing was for sure, he would forever be remembered as the night drive killer, terrorizing the roads on stormy nights. And Sarah, who was the first known survivor of his attack, could never forget the terror she had experienced on that fateful night drive. It was a typical night when Alex was driving to a friend's engagement party. He was in a good mood, looking forward to the upcoming fun. But something about that night was unusual. The road was deserted, and the only sound was the pounding of the rain on his windshield. As he drove, he saw a figure standing on the side of the road. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, but as he got closer, he realized it was a woman. She was dressed in a long white gown, and her hair was wild and unkempt. She looked lost and alone, and Alex couldn't help but feel sorry for her. He pulled over and offered to give her a ride, but she didn't respond. She just looked at him with empty eyes, as if she was in a trance. Alex shrugged it off and assumed she was in shock, and helped her into his car. As he drove, he tried to make small talk, but the woman remained silent. He couldn't shake off the feeling of unease, and he couldn't help but glance at her in the rearview mirror. Her eyes were still empty, and she looked as if she was staring straight through him. Suddenly, the woman spoke. "You should have left me on the side of the road." Her voice was cold and menacing, and Alex could feel the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He tried to ignore it and continued driving, but the woman's words kept repeating in his head. As they approached a fork in the road, the woman pointed to the left and said, "Take that road." Alex had a feeling that he should not take that road, but something compelled him to listen to her. As they drove down the deserted road, Alex could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He could see nothing but darkness ahead, and he had a feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Just then, the woman spoke again. "You made a mistake coming down this road. You'll never make it out alive." Alex's heart froze as he realized the woman was not just a lost soul, but something far more sinister. He tried to turn the car around, but it was too late. The road had become a maze, and he was trapped. The woman cackled as she revealed her true form, a vengeful spirit seeking revenge on anyone who dared to cross her path. As the spirit closed in, Alex's car suddenly swerved off the road and crashed into a tree. He was knocked unconscious and everything went black. When he woke up, he was in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines. The doctor told him that he had been in a coma for several days. As he lay there, Alex couldn't shake off the feeling that the night's events were not just a dream, but a premonition of what was to come. As Alex lay there in the hospital, he couldn't help but replay the events of that night in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that these events actually happened. He tried to tell the doctors and nurses about the woman, but they just looked at him with confusion and concern. They assured him that he had been in a coma for several days and that it was all just a dream. But Alex knew deep down that it was not just a dream, it was a warning. As he recovered from his injuries, he couldn't help but feel a sense of dread whenever he thought about that night. He started researching the area where the accident occurred and soon discovered that there were several reports of strange occurrences on that road. People had reported seeing ghostly apparitions, and some had even claimed to have been attacked by something paranormal. Alex knew that he had to do something to prevent others from falling victim to the same fate. He started to spread awareness about the dangers of that road and even organized a ghost hunting trip to investigate the area. The group of ghost hunters, including Alex, set out on a stormy night, just like the night of Alex's accident. They were armed with all the necessary equipment to capture any paranormal activity. As they drove down the road of no return, Alex couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. As they approached the fork in the road, Alex's heart skipped a beat as he remembered the woman pointing to the left and telling him to take that road. He tried to shake off the feeling of dread, but it was too late. They were already on the road, and there was no turning back. As they drove deeper into the darkness, strange things began to happen. The temperature dropped, and the wind picked up. They heard strange noises, and the car radio started to malfunction. Suddenly, the car came to a stop, and the engine wouldn't start. They were stranded on a road in the middle of nowhere with no way to call for help. As they got out of the car to investigate, they saw a figure standing in the distance. A man from this group decided to go out and come closer to this figure. As he got closer, he realized that the figure on the road was a local farmer walking home from the bar. They talked, and the farmer said that the failures in the radio began due to the fact that there was a military base nearby, which jammed the sound waves, and the engine stalled due to the fact that the owner of the car did not take it to a car service for a long time. In the end, after driving a few more miles, they did not find anything paranormal. Alex still did not let go of the thought that everything really happened, because it was so real. He felt then every cell of his body. There was a strong thunderstorm that night. A group of young people who are keen on searching for UFOs went to a place where, according to the latest reports, people saw strange objects in the sky. As they drove deeper into the rural area, the storm intensified. Lightning struck the trees around them, casting eerie shadows on the winding road. The friends began to feel uneasy, but they pressed on, convinced that they were on the verge of a major discovery. They had all read about the mysterious lights in the sky, and they were convinced that they were about to witness something truly extraordinary. Finally, they reached their destination, a field on the outskirts of a small town. They set up their equipment and waited for the UFOs to appear. But as the minutes ticked by, nothing happened. The friends began to grow restless and were about to pack up and leave when they saw a bright light in the distance. They immediately turned on their cameras and started recording. Their excitement turned to terror as the light grew closer, and they realized it was not a UFO, but a massive, glowing orb. It was unlike anything they had ever seen before and seemed to be getting closer and closer. Just as the orb was about to collide with them, it suddenly stopped and hovered in the air. The friends were paralyzed with fear, but then they noticed something even more bizarre. The orb was emitting a strange, pulsing energy that seemed to be communicating with them telepathically. They could hear a voice in their minds, but it was not in any language they knew. They were confused and scared, but the voice seemed to be calming and reassuring. The energy told them not to be afraid, that they were not alone in the universe and that they were part of a greater plan. The friends were amazed and overcome with emotion as they realized that they had just had a close encounter of the third kind. They were in awe of the experience. They couldn't believe what they were seeing and hearing. They were convinced that they were witnessing something truly extraordinary. The storm outside subsided, the sky cleared, and the friends were able to see the stars. They packed up their equipment and headed back home, their minds buzzing with excitement and wonder. They couldn't wait to share their experience with others and to analyze the footage they had captured. They had set out to find UFOs, and instead, they had found something even more incredible. They knew that they would never forget that stormy night and the incredible encounter that changed their lives forever. They had witnessed something that was beyond human understanding, and that was enough for them. They knew that they would always keep searching for the truth, hoping that one day they would be able to have another encounter. As they drove home, the friends couldn't help but feel grateful for the positive ending of the night. They had been through an experience that they would never forget, and they were all convinced that they had witnessed something truly extraordinary. They were excited to share their experience with others and to analyze the footage they had captured. They were determined to find out the truth behind what they had seen and to share it with the world. Later, they found out that in fact it was ball lightning and that they survived when they met with it. They were very lucky, and they could not explain all the paranormal phenomena that happened to them because they did not find other cases of meeting with ball lightning, so that someone would survive after that. The weather then was, to put it mildly, terrible. It was foggy and everything around was deserted. There was not a single person within a radius of at least 1 mile. Officer John had been on patrol for hours, his eyes scanning the deserted streets for any sign of trouble. As he turned down a quiet side road, he noticed a car moving slowly in the distance. He couldn't quite make out the details, but something about the way it was moving made him suspicious. He flipped on his lights and pulled the car over. As he approached the driver's side window, he could see that there was only one person inside. The driver, a middle-aged man, looked up at him with a blank expression. Officer John could see that something was off, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. "License and registration, please," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. The man handed over the documents, and Officer John couldn't help but notice that his hands were shaking. He scanned the license and registration, but everything seemed to be in order. He handed the documents back and asked, "Is everything okay? You seem a little on edge." The man just stared at him, his eyes empty and cold. Officer John felt a chill run down his spine. He started to reach for his radio to call for backup. But before he could, the man suddenly lunged forward, lunging at Officer John. The man was incredibly fast, and before Officer John knew it, he was pinned against the car, the man's hands around his throat. The man's eyes were wild with madness, and he snarled, "You can't stop me. I have to finish what I started." Officer John struggled against the man's grip, but he was too strong. Just as he was about to black out, he saw a figure emerging from the shadows. It was a woman, her hair matted and her clothes torn. Her eyes were filled with a terrible rage, and she lunged at the man, pulling him off of Officer John. The man let out a scream and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Officer John alone with the woman. She looked at him with a mix of gratitude and sorrow, and said, "He's been doing this for years. Kills and mutilates bodies of his victims. I've been trying to stop him, but he always finds me. I'm so sorry." With that, she too disappeared into the night, leaving Officer John to try and make sense of what had just happened. He never spoke of that night again, but the memory of it haunted him for the rest of his days. He had come face to face with true evil, and it had changed him forever. John was in shock, trying to process what had just happened. He stumbled back to his patrol car, his hands shaking as he reached for his radio. He called for backup and an ambulance, his voice barely above a whisper. He felt like he was in a nightmare and couldn't believe that the events that just occurred were real. When backup arrived, they found Officer sitting in his car, still in shock. He tried to tell them what had happened, but his words were jumbled and incoherent. They rushed him to the hospital, where he was treated for shock and minor injuries. As the days passed, Officer John struggled to come to terms with what had happened. He couldn't shake the image of the man's wild eyes and the woman's words. He's been doing this for years. Kills and mutilates bodies of his victims. He couldn't understand how someone could do such a thing. He spent his days going over the details of the incident in his head, trying to find some explanation for what had happened. He started to notice that there had been a string of strange murders in the area, all of the same MO, victims found dead with no signs of struggle. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were connected to the man he had pulled over that night. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Officer John dug deeper into the case. He spoke to witnesses, scoured through reports, and even went undercover to try and find any leads. But the more he uncovered, the more twisted and terrifying the case became. He soon discovered that the man he had pulled over was not just a murderer, but a serial killer with a twisted obsession. He was a master of manipulation and had the ability to charm and lure his victims, making them trust him before he struck. During the investigation, he managed to establish the identity of the victims of this maniac, and he was horrified to identify in one of the victims the very woman who had helped him. She was killed in the exact same spot a few feet away from that incident. The realization that this monster had been hiding in plain sight for so long, preying on innocent people, made Officer John feel sick to his stomach. He knew that he had to put an end to the killer's reign of terror, no matter the cost. With the help of his fellow officers, they were able to track the killer down and finally put an end to his killing spree. But the memories of that night and the knowledge of the evil that existed in the world would stay with Officer John forever.